Hello and welcome to the September 21st edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway and I'm here with my colleague Romeo.
Hey, y'all.
This episode, other than our frontline update, of course, we have 4 topics of importance for you. 1 light one and 3 more serious ones. But first, I would like to give a small announcement. With my work with the Kyiv Independent, I voiced a new documentary with the War Crimes Investigation Unit called Bullet Holes. It is an investigation into the shooting deaths of 3 children who the Russian army killed in the opening weeks of the war. All of them in the process of escaping from occupied territory into Ukrainian-controlled territory. It was a very difficult documentary to do. It's, of course, very heavy subject matter. Talks, of course, about children being killed. It's very sad, but I would just like to announce it as it's a very big project. It was released. We want, maximum exposure for it. It's very, very important. But into that, I would like to talk about something that happened into Romeo and I's life recently, which is that we went to the Transcarpathian town of Berchova for a wedding. We're not here to talk about the wedding. Our mutual friend got married, but the setting of that wedding I thought was something really worth talking about. It was very fascinating, and Romeo agrees with me on that. It's a very, very interesting place. So Berchova is one of the main cities of the Hungarian ethnic and linguistic minority within Ukraine. If you go there, a lot of, the signs are in Hungarian. I went into a Hungarian language bookstore. I struggled with Google Translate to say some small phrases in Hungarian, just to be polite. It's a very fascinating town, including it is location of a Hungarian language university. And in the context of all this, the issue of language rights, of various language topics in Ukraine, especially with these very small minority groups, has been in and out of the news very often. Before we want to get into that, though, Romeo, do you have any initial ideas about the place?
So, not about Berchova specifically, but I'd like our listeners to get a real sense of the complex and fascinating history of this region of Ukraine, Zakarpattia. Because, and I think this joke, it's about a nearby town to Berchova called Mukachevo. And I think this joke really encapsulates a lot of the kind of absurdities and complexities of the region. So it goes a little like this. St. Peter is greeting a newcomer standing at the gates to heaven. St. Peter asks the man, "Where were you born?" The man replies, "Austro-Hungary." He asks him, "Where did you go to school?" The man replies, "Czechoslovakia." St. Peter asks, "Where were you married?" He says, "Hungary." "What about your kids? Where were they born?" "The Third Reich." "And your grandchildren?" "The USSR." And where did you die?" "I died in Ukraine." St. Peter goes, "You've had a really eventful and traveling life." And the man goes, "Nonsense. I never left Mukachevo." This kind of insane changing of borders, changing of political entities, changing of entire ideologies, all in a single person's lifetime, really has contributed to the incredibly rich fabric. I honestly think it's probably one of the, historically speaking, probably one of the more fascinating places of the world, just because, again, this guy never left his little town. And there were 7 or 8 polities mentioned that controlled his little town. And Berchova, being pretty close to Mukachevo, about a 40-minute drive, is very much a town in that same vein. Been controlled and occupied by so many different political entities, by so many different countries, and been a part of so many different countries, but it still has retained its very unique character.
Yeah, like before all that, I'd also say that there's like a Carpathian identity that's a part of, where Hungarian, like Hungarians, Romanians, Slovaks, these different Ukrainian ethnic groups, the Hutsuls, the Wemkos, the Rusians. It's a very ethnically complex region, like mountains are. Like, you can look at any mountain chain in the world and you run into this kind of thing, because when you have difficult transit. One valley can have one culture and another valley can have another culture, but they all have to, deal with each other in different ways. Mountains are very interesting that way, and not as extreme as the Caucasus, for example, but it's an interesting thing. And so when I see Ukrainian Carpathian things, it's very obvious that there is a lot of, cultural mixing between, like I said, Romanians, Hungarians, like everyone else in the region. And that is in a way unique from even the rest of the country.
What really struck me about modern Berhove, and this is something I didn't quite understand on a visceral level, especially when a couple of years back, when the language politics issue was really gaining resonance, it was being discussed all the time, and there was a real, what I now understand to be a failure of communication or a failure of comprehension on the Ukrainian side, because a lot of the Ukrainians were like, well, you live in Ukraine. Why would you resist your kids going to Ukrainian school? Like, why is that a big deal to you? And they had trouble understanding it because in the Ukrainian mind, Zakarpattia has a unique identity that is Zakarpattian, and it doesn't exactly match to being a Hungarian or Romanian or even strictly Ukrainian identity. Very much as the Carpathian identity. But when I went to Berhove, the first thing that strikes you is A, bilingual signs are everywhere, and B, everyone speaks Hungarian to each other. Like the default language, the base language that everyone talks to each other in is Hungarian. It's their language, it's their culture. And they obviously have very strong ties to Hungary. The border is barely 5 kilometers away. And it makes sense why they would be so resistant to dictates from a government in Kiev telling them what language their children have to learn.
Yes, it's an issue of they had always been there, depending on whatever state controlled them. So why should they have to change for what other governments do? But I think that the language issue that the Hungarian government especially has been using to kind of separate them apart from other Ukrainians. The other thing you notice in Berhove is that you still see, for example, the same monuments to soldiers who were killed in the Russian invasion, except instead of having names that end in Enko or other Slavic names, they have Hungarian Magyar names. But other than that, it's the same monument, it's the same feeling. In some ways, the Hungarian-speaking community in Ukraine has gone out of its way to really show itself as being truly Ukrainian, truly a part of the Ukrainian political, if not ethnic nation, and to make a statement out of it that they are loyal, that they are not foreign. And there's been many instances of rather prominent Hungarian speakers. One became quite famous as a university professor, giving lectures from the trench back to his students at university. And he now has some government position in the education ministry, I forgot which, but he became kind of an icon. Like people didn't even know he was ethnic Hungarian until more details came out about him. First, it was just there's a Ukrainian hero showing what you do, that you are, a citizen soldier doing what you have to and filling all your responsibilities. It didn't come out till later that he was Hungarian and therefore became a symbol of the kind of unity of the Hungarian ethnic community with the Ukrainian ethnic community and the Ukrainian political community. So that is also very visible on the streets, just like it is in every other town and city in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that feel like they are fighting the same war that everyone else is. They don't feel like this is some foreign abstract conflict that barely touches them. Just like every other Ukrainian, they are deeply, deeply affected by the war, and they are contributing in probably outsized ways, considering that the minority is not that large, to defending Ukraine from the Russian invasion.
I think with a lot of topics we're about to say this day, this is something to look more into, the issue of these ethnic minorities and how they're interfacing with the Ukrainian identity, and how hopefully there will be more sensitivity towards the needs of minority communities in Ukraine as a result of this national unity that we're all feeling. But yeah, we don't really have too much to go on here just because, we passed through this town and we didn't really do much research within our few hours there. But just the impact that it left on me was quite important and should be explored further. I think you probably feel the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I am planning to go back sometimes this winter, and to learn more and more. And because, to be honest, even that joke I relayed, it really blows my mind how a person can live through so many different countries and experiences and still just be in the same place. We tend to think of nations as these monolithic, eternal entities, but that is very much development of the post-World War II world. It's a new thing. And in this part of the world, that's very much a development of the 90s. And I think it's always important to remember that what we think is eternal and unchangeable is in many ways artificial and modern.
Things are always the same until they change.
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
Yes, so that was our light topic that we just about a good weekend that we had. So I guess time to get into the more serious news of the week. And we'll begin with an update from the front line. There's not much to say. It has been a bit quieter of a week than, not quieter, of course, but less changing of a week than it has in the past. The counteroffensive, after breaking through that first line of defense, has slowed down a bit as it grinds against the second line of defense that we've been talking about over and over. You get the idea. They are now,
the things that we've said,
yeah,
will be challenges are in fact challenges.
Yeah, like you get it by now. The reports from the front line have been that these underground concrete bunkers that make up the second line of defense have provided a whole new set of challenges compared to the minefields of the first line of defense. Now there's less minefields, but more fortifications. We've gone over this, but it's borne out more and more over this last week or two.
I would note that this switch to these prepared fortifications over minefields may signal the need for Ukraine to start deploying more armored power. Ukraine has been very reluctant to to send groups of tanks. They usually will attach one or two to an infantry unit for fire support. And it would be very rare for a group of them to gather because that makes them an easy target for artillery, for cruise missiles, for drone attacks. But now that the Ukrainian defenses are encountering these bunkers and these prepared fortifications, that might signal a need to start grouping armor, because that is traditionally what you would use the grouped armor for, is specifically in this scenario. Though again, the tank's vulnerability, especially to modern kamikaze drones, is still an issue that needs addressing.
And of course, we're in the fall. And as everyone knows of how warfare works in this area, the fall brings mud, and with mud will become harder conditions for armor, both of the tracked and wheeled variety. So we're about a month away from that starting to get bad, although who's to say? The weather has not exactly been predictable. Global warming both works for and against us.
Thanks, Al Gore.
Yes. Next, we'll look at Bakhmut. So all these many weeks we've been talking about the attacks on Klashivka and Andrivka to the south of Bakhmut and how we're weeks away from them falling. Well, it finally fully happened. Ukraine is now in full control over both Klashivka and Andrivka. Andrivka being a small village, Klashivka being a more substantial town that formerly hosted the Russian command in their assaults against the Chasiv Yar area. So that is now fully under Ukrainian control. The next step looks like it will probably be a railroad line, the railroad line running north-south to Bakhmut. It is an obvious front line in that, picture any railroad line. There will be, a line of, it'll be slightly elevated and then a line of trees on either side. That's quite obvious where the fighting will take place next. To to push more around the bottom side of Bakhmut. We have not seen advances on the northern side of Bakhmut yet to match it, but we'll see where this goes. The Russians did redeploy one elite VDV unit from the Bakhmut area down to the Zaporizhia Oblast. As we've said over and over, the Russians are trying desperately to shift their resources around to where they think they become more useful. Well, in this case, the lack of this Vediva unit around Bakhmut could lead to more advances in that direction. And finally, on the Ukrainian front lines, north of that, we have the Kupiansk offensive from the Russians trying to move into the northern parts of Kharkiv Oblast. And once again, no progress has been made by the Russians in their offensive. But there's one front that just opened up, which I think is very fascinating. We have seen Ukrainian special services act within the Russian Federation, a lot of behind enemy lines activity.
In fact, 4 Russian aircraft were just torched at a airfield right outside Moscow.
Yep, it's happening with greater and greater frequency. But now we have a whole other continent that warfare is taking place on. A Wagner Group unit working in Sudan. Wagner, who knows what their status is organizationally, but they are still operating in Africa under who knows whose auspices. But a group of them was killed in Sudan by what appears to be a Ukrainian drone. So, and afterwards, Budanov, the Ukrainian intelligence head, made some interesting remarks where, once again, he doesn't take super direct responsibility, but certainly takes indirect responsibility for this happening. So, Ukraine, its attacks are now global. It is now a global war, as small scale as that may be. There's no place on the planet where Russians are safe, and I think that's something very important to communicate. Russia's neo-colonial empire, it's been very proud of its advances, especially into Africa, into Syria, into Libya. And I think this is going to occur with greater frequency, as these always do. These attacks always start off slow and build up steam, that they cannot just have their empire without being harassed. Ukraine will now compete with them on a global level, not just in between their two countries.
While this is unlikely to turn into a World War II spy thriller with the Allies hunting the Nazis all throughout the world, it is relatively cheap to send a guy with a bunch of TNT and a drone to blow up some Russian military object somewhere in Africa. The kind of cheapness of attacks that we've seen terrorist organizations exploit throughout modern history, throughout the modern era, is something that nation states can also exploit, even if they haven't yet. But since Ukraine is so much more limited in resources, in money, in simple diplomatic access than the Russians, I think we'll see more of these tactics be adopted as time goes on.
Our next topic will be a bit of a historical one, but I think one to kind of meditate on. And that was the anniversary of the assassination of Georgiy Gongadze. As you may be able to tell from his last name, Gongadze was Georgian. He was from Georgia, but moved to Ukraine fairly early in his life. During the 1990s, he was a journalist, yes, but he was also involved in trying to recruit Ukrainians to go and support Georgia in its wars against the separatist Russian-backed groups in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This effort obviously did not fully pan out. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are still under Russian occupation. But he did develop into a very successful journalist in Ukraine, a very successful investigative journalist looking into corruption and various malfeasance by the Ukrainian government in the 1990s. And like everywhere else in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, this was a very corrupt, mafia-driven kind of place. In most of these countries, that problem has significantly declined. It has declined in Ukraine due to his efforts, partially. But that was a very dangerous environment for a journalist to work in. And he was the founder of the very famous outlet Ukrainska Pravda. If you follow Ukraine, you should be reading Ukrainska Pravda as one of your resources. It is a
But don't forget to read the New Voice of Ukraine.
New Voice of Ukraine, which is
the sister publication of Ukrainianska Pravda.
Yes, similar.
Which I'm the managing editor of.
Yes, we don't bring that up enough on this podcast. Actually, Romeo is the managing editor of the English edition of New Voice of Ukraine. New Voice of Ukraine is under the same ownership as Ukrainianska Pravda. We're all very related in Ukraine. This is a small world. So he was, as the founder of Ukrainianska Pravda, he again did these investigative reports and was harassed by the intelligence services, most likely on suggestion of various corrupt officials and their connections to the mafia.
This is, and his work eventually gained him the highest enemy you can get in Ukraine, which is the second president of Ukraine at the time, Leonid Kuchma.
Yes. So this was the Kuchma era, and he ran afoul of the Kuchma administration. And while we'll get into what that means in just a second, what it meant for him is that on the September 16th in the year 2000, he was disappeared and his body later discovered in a town near Kiev, in the Kiev region. This murder became what I believe is a very serious inflection point in the history of Ukraine. We Romeo and I had a very long conversation about this over the weekend. But in my opinion, this was, if there's any one singular event that you can look at that put Ukraine on the democratic road that led us to where we are now as something that's very importantly not Russia, it is the reaction to his murder by civil society. After this murder took place, a Ukrainian politician named Alexander Moroz of the Socialist Party got a hold of some tapes in the Kuchma office, and that included Kuchma more or less admitting to ordering the hit. It wasn't super direct. It kind of implied they wanted to get him to Chechnya, which it was, of course, at war at the time, and most likely would have been an indirect way of killing him. But it was implicated in this assassination.
So Kuchma likely, and again, while there is very strong evidence implicating Kuchma in Gongadze's disappearance, there is no smoking gun, as there rarely is in this situation, but there is enough evidence to speculate on Kuchma's motivations in taking such a matter. Gongadze was a very prominent journalist at the time. Otherwise, his murder would not have sparked the response that it did. But Gongadze, or his family, that Gongadze was working with evidence from the Central Election Commission that would have proven that Kuchma's victory for his second term was a rigged election, that the vote was rigged, that it was illegitimate, and that Kuchma did not actually win, that he had actually come in fifth. If that story that Gongadze was working on, if he truly was working on it, as his family says, was never published, and to this day there is no evidence or connections to verify that allegation. But if true, revealing that the president had not actually his election in a free and fair election, or as free as fair you can get in the 90s in Ukraine, that would have been motive enough for Gongadze to have been silenced. And that article was never published.
During that, the 1999 election, there was another mysterious assassination that Kuchma has been blamed for, which was Vyacheslav Chornovil. Chornovil being one of the leaders of the Ruch movement, the dissident movement during the Soviet Union turned national democratic movement in independent Ukraine. He was in a car crash near the airport, actually, in the city of Boryspil. And what is assumed from the information available was that this car wreck was planned, that someone within the security services attached to Kuchma had Chornovil killed that night. So this would not have been this definitely would not have been the only corpse from Kuchma's administration. But Kuchma is an interesting figure in that we have to compare him to what was going on in Russia at the time. So we have, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there is a serious fracture internal in both countries. There was a lot of decentralization of kind of local oligarchs, local strongmen, really becoming the real movers and shakers in these two countries. And we are looking at both Kuchma and Yeltsin in Russia trying to piece them together. And while we do say that Kuchma probably had people killed to protect his political power, he did not go as far as Yeltsin did in his violence and bringing everything down. Yeltsin, of course, was responsible for invading Chechnya. A lot more assassinations. Russia in the 90s was a haven for assassinations. And ultimately, the centralization process done by Yeltsin was handed off to Putin, Putin being directly appointed by Yeltsin as his heir, and all the state consolidation done by Yeltsin was turned up to 11 by Putin. And the violence, everything became so much worse. While in Ukraine, this opposition to Kuchma's centralization processes led to this Ukraine without Kuchma movement. The Ukraine without Kuchma movement came from the protest against the assassination of Gongadze. And that created a very powerful democratic movement that was also backed by some oligarchic interests who did not want to see centralization. And that trend led next to the Orange Revolution a few years later, Maidan a few years later, and since Maidan, the kind of extreme reforms that happened. So the Ukrainian society reacted against Kuchma's corruption, while the Russian society did not. And also importantly, Kuchma himself made certain political decisions in the 90s and 2000s not to press as hard as Yeltsin did. Kuchma also at times faced a hostile parliament, but unlike Yeltsin, who literally bombed the parliament when they tried to go against him. And not that either side in that conflict was good. No need to go into that. Yeltsin was probably the more friendly of the two in that conflict. But there was no shelling of the White House moment with Kuchma. He was not as... There are certain factors in Ukrainian society, but also within the character of Kuchma that did not go as far down that road here as it did there.
Ukraine's parliament was very much able to resist the dictates of the president without fear of at least being militarily repressed. That kind of thing would have been entirely beyond the pale, which allowed them to repel these kind of four centralizing initiatives that Kuchma wanted to pass in the 2000s. He wanted to cut the number of lawmakers in parliament. He wanted to establish a two-chamber parliament. He wanted to change the constitution to give the president more influence over government. And while Ukrainians and the Constitutional Court both supported the results of a referendum that he introduced to implement all of this, the Rada just said, no, we're not going to do it. This is an usurpation of our influence, of our power, and we refuse to support it. And while in this similar situation, Yeltsin literally called on the military, Kuchma was ultimately taken down.
Yeah, so that brings up like a lot of issues because obviously Ukraine and Russia started from a very similar place with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Obviously, both inheriting a lot of the same structure, a lot of the same bureaucracy, and as hard it is to say sometimes, a lot of the same, at least, uh, political culture. But so we then have to look at why did these two countries develop differently? One answer is to go deeper into, culture and history of Ukrainians. Look at the Cossacks as the proto republicans and the political freedoms that have gone back hundreds of years. Yes, that's true. But there are also these very specific events that took place where people made a different decision. And that is often what history becomes, is these decisions that are made to react to the same events. And in Russia, we have the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya. While that is looked on outside of Russia as pretty important, inside of Russia, it probably was just put aside. Well, in Ukraine, civil society made a choice to make this a very serious issue that, like I just described a bit ago, kind of crystallized a democratic reaction to oligarchic rule. And so we kind of went a bit afield from there to this one specific event that happened September 16th in the year 2000, the assassination of Gongadze. But it's a very important thing. There's a statue of him in Kiev. It's a very important event to understand Ukraine.
And speaking personally as a journalist, his assassination left a real legacy, developed this kind of combative, independent feeling, not amongst all journalists and not amongst all orgs, but it seeded the tradition of this independent, combative, anti-authoritarian viewpoint or kind of stance for Ukrainian journalists that would culminate during the Maidan of the kind of flowering explosion of Ukraine independent media. And his legacy is very much echoed by modern Ukrainian journalists. He's been cited as an inspiration to a lot of journalists that I know and I look up to. And his kind of resistance to the office of the president is certainly a tradition that has been very strongly kept up by pretty much everyone since then.
So yes, Georgiy Gongadze, may your memory be a blessing.
Rest in power.
Our next topic revolves around the grain trade between Ukraine and its neighbors to the west in the European Union, in particularly Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. This has, in the latest days, become a very heated political topic with a lot of very terse words and some pretty big diplomatic actions taken between the two governments. A lot of nasty words have been said, including by myself, if you follow me on Twitter. So just a background of what is going on right now. So with the war and Ukraine being cut off from the Black Sea, especially with Russia now reneging on its grain deal commitments, Ukraine has relied on transporting its grain and really everything else westward through Poland, Romania, etc. Ukraine needs to have an economy, and its economy, a lot of it went through Odessa port. That is no longer an option. Now, Ukraine is a very important agricultural country, and of course, one of the main products that Ukraine shipped was grain and similar agricultural products. Most of these are meant for markets far afield, Egypt, Indonesia, China. A lot of global south countries are big importers of Ukrainian grain. However, a lot of this did end up in neighboring countries, Poland, as I've been saying. This led to two serious problems in these countries. One of them is that, of course, with the grain first entering into these countries, a lot of it ended up being sold in these countries as well, meaning that prices went way down from the new large supply. Now, you as a consumer are probably thinking, well, food prices going down is a good thing. Well, it's not a good thing for farmers. And so farmers in these countries have been complaining about how, due to the cost decreases, they've been losing money. And the second problem of this is the issue of storage. Grain needs to be stored, but then before it can go onwards, even if it's not being sold in those countries, it still requires a lot of silos and such in order to hold the grain before it can be sold. Ukrainian grain has taken up a lot of the storage capacity in these countries, making it difficult and therefore more expensive for farmers to store their product. And food is perishable. It has to be sold. If it is not sold, it spoils. So a farmer with a lot of grain that can't be stored, that is possible lost product. So those are the two issues that farmers and the agricultural lobby in these countries have been complaining about. And so a few months ago, as we did an episode on, they banned the sale of Ukrainian grain in their countries, including at first transit. So being transported to Polish ports, other ports and such that require you to go through Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania to get through. This led to a decision by the European Union that although these individual countries cannot actually make these decisions on their own, they decided to play the peacemaker and say that there could be a ban on Ukrainian grain for a certain amount of time up until an expiry date. Well, we hit that expiry date. The European Union said that this ban would not continue. Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia have decided to extend the ban on their own in contravention of these decisions. This led to a series of back and forth diplomatic actions by especially Ukraine and Poland, the two main actors in this, especially since Poland is mostly a friend, unlike Hungary, to where Ukraine is now taking this to the World Trade Organization for the World Trade Organization to launch an investigation whether Poland is allowed to do these things, and if it is decided they are not allowed to do these things, force Poland to change their minds. Ukraine also introduced a reciprocal ban on Polish fruits and vegetables, a few different kinds, onions, and so forth. This, of course, made Poland very angry. A lot of words were said about how there's some Russian influence in Ukraine trying to ruin Polish-Ukrainian relations. Zelensky, in turn, in a speech to the UN, referred to Moscow influence, without naming specific names, as being behind this crisis. The Bulgarian prime minister, in his decision not to extend this ban, referred to Kremlin influence as the cause of problems in his own country. But really, this is not about Poland and Ukraine. This is about the Polish government, domestically and especially with the European Union. Polish elections are October 15th. The ruling party, Law and Justice in Poland, is populist, nationalistic, appeals to farmers, rural people. It's a conservative party and has all the traits that you can expect a conservative party to have. So they have to make a show of standing up for the Polish farmer against foreign aggression, and they also may have to make a stand against the European Union. They have to tell their conservative constituency that they are not going to do what the European Union tells them to do, even though the whole point of being part of a common market is you're not making these trade decisions unilaterally. It's supposed to be a joint decision, but they have to fight against that idea as part of their nationalistic party platform. So yeah, this is not really about Ukraine. This is really about Poland's own issues, and Ukraine is just going to be a punching bag for that. Unfortunately, with a lot of unfortunate statements by the Polish government and its proxies along the way. Statements that can be interpreted as some kind of Ukraine fatigue by Poland's allies elsewhere in the West, who see Poland, Ukraine's staunchest ally. If they are going to start giving up on Ukraine, then maybe it's their turn to as well, even if that may not be the Polish government's actual intention. But actual intentions don't matter compared to actual actions. Some of these statements can be interpreted to be extremely bad, such as Poland saying that it could no longer or would no longer be providing weapons to Ukraine. The more generous interpretation of this is the one that the Polish government seems to be trying to focus on, which is them saying that they've already given Ukraine everything that they could give. They would no longer be able to transfer old Soviet tech because they just don't have any left. That is one interpretation. The other interpretation that people heard is that Poland was ending support for the country. Poland has also threatened the kind of welfare aid for Ukrainian refugees in the country. And Poland is a major home for Ukrainian refugees. And if their support systems are pulled out from under them over a trade dispute, it's hard to picture how cruel that would be. Now, I think that this will reach a resolution. Allies have trade disputes all the time. The United States and Canada, as close as countries can possibly be, have their own trade disputes over logging and such. This can be fixed, but I don't see it really being fixed until after the election, when Poland can kind of turn down its populist rhetoric. So we're looking at a rough month in Polish-Ukrainian relations that hopefully will not spill over into anything worse. But that leads us to our final, and I think our real headline topic, which is the government of Azerbaijan invading its secessionist province, as much of the world sees it, or as the Armenian Republic of Artsakh, as they see it, and invading this region after a long buildup of very, genocidal rhetoric so for the last few months, the Nagorno Karabakh region has been under blockade by the Azeri government. They have not had access to food, to medical care. They have been slowly starving on very much starvation bread rations. We talked about how this was, in a very recent episode, how this was becoming worse and worse. We had an interview a few episodes back about it. We've been covering Armenia quite a lot, and this is what it all led to. So on Tuesday, September 19th, the Azeri government announced to begin a counterterrorism operation within Nagorno-Karabakh. This was after a mine explosion that killed a few Azeris, but it was very obvious that this is what it was leading to. They had been starving and surrounding this region for a very long time, making it very, very vulnerable and open to attack. So shortly after the announcement of this counterterrorism operation, as they say, they began to shell the Karabakh capital of Stepanakert. And I gotta tell you, I felt a pit in my stomach watching videos of this happening. I know what that looks like. I know what that feels like, of these artillery shells, these artillery pieces hitting.
Ukrainians very well know what it's like to have your civilian areas shelled.
Yeah, very ugly. And I know what I was looking at there. And I felt it deep in my gut of, there were children who were killed, many civilians who were killed. The Azerbaijan government claimed that it was only attacking military targets, but we saw who was actually dying.
Yeah, it's a patent lie. You can, from the information that we do have in the videos that have gotten out, and mind you, most of Nagorno Karabakh is unreachable, uncontactable. Stepanakert, being the capital, has at least some lines of communication to the outside world, but a lot of the villages, most of them likely just don't. They have been completely cut off. And the Azeri government has simply been lying about what it's been doing. I'm very concerned that when the Azeri military begins to stabilize the area, and when we do get contact with these evacuated or with the surrounding villages, that we will see images that we've seen in Mariupol, in Bucha, in Irpin. The dehumanizing rhetoric used by the Azeri government at the very highest levels, going all the way to the top, of their dictator, Aliyev, has made it clear that their intent is extermination.
I'd say, like, even being used to Russian anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, Azeri anti-Armenian rhetoric goes further than that.
That is really saying something, mind you.
That really is saying something. At least the Russians pretend that Ukrainians are just fake Russians that they will eventually bring back into the fold. The Azeri rhetoric about Armenians has been outright exterminationist. Then when it depicts Armenians, it looks exactly like Nazi propaganda before and during World War II. They have openly, well, at times they have said that, we are just bringing this population back into Azerbaijan and we will welcome them and it'll all be fine. But as we've seen from other parts of Nagorno Karabakh who were taken by Azerbaijan in the last war 3 years ago, that is simply not the case. There are no Armenians left in those areas, and Armenian heritage has been significantly destroyed.
The Azeri government has gone out of its way to wipe out historical markers of Armenian habitation in the area. They've destroyed 2,000-year-old churches. They've covered up historic graveyards. They have really gone a long way to ensuring that not only are there no living Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh, but that there were never Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh. And if you know anything about history, that phrase should really chill you to the bone.
Yeah, I saw that the Azeri military in this operation has taken control over the monastery where the Armenian alphabet was first taught. So that will be a huge historic loss when the obvious happens there. Again, with these villages, we have to talk about that the Azeri ground forces have surrounded quite a few villages that we just don't know what's happening there for the reasons already explained. But yeah, we can probably expect a few buchas going on at the moment. If not, I will be very surprised.
I mean, relieved incredibly, but surprised.
Very relieved, but very surprised because that's what Azerbaijan said that they want to do. And we know what they have done. Well, before we go on talking about this, yes, we do have to acknowledge that the 1990s war between Azerbaijan and Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh was a very ugly one that also included a lot of atrocities committed against Azeris, and destruction of mosques and things like that as well. We do not wish to make this a only one-sided conflict. It's very complicated. Neither of us are sufficiently connected to this conflict to really have to really, take sides or anything like that. We don't want to do that. But we know what's happening now.
And we are on the sides of civilians not being mass murdered. That is our side. That is the stance the Ukraine without hype is taking and will always take. We do not, under any circumstances, support the mass murder of civilians. It's really weird that we keep having to repeat this and to make that explicit. But that's the world we live in. You shouldn't mass murder civilians, guys. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. Real simple.
Yes. Regardless of what may have happened in the past, no matter who may have been right or wrong in the past, what we have is the present. And in the present, we are looking at a potential genocide. So on that point, with this all done, one of the demands of Azerbaijan was for the Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh defense forces to lay down their arms and give up being a militia, to demilitarize the area. And it seems as though the Artsakh authorities, the the unrecognized republic government of this area, has agreed to those demands, although there is still fighting going on. So we know that we know that they have not given up their arms entirely, and we know that Azerbaijan has not stopped attacking. But there was a speech not long ago, like an hour ago, as of time of recording, that Aliyev, the dictator of Azerbaijan, declared victory in the counterterrorism operation, and that Nagorno Karabakh was once again part of Azeri sovereignty.
Now, very concernedly, the Azeri forces, according to Armenian sources on the ground, have sent some mass text messages to all Armenian mobile phone numbers, telling them that there will be a humanitarian corridor opened, but only for women, children, and the elderly. Men were not mentioned in this humanitarian corridor, which means there is that is as the Azeri government explicitly not giving any guarantee as to the survival of every prone man in Nagorno Karabakh.
Safe to assume that they are going to treat all military-aged men as militants, which is, we saw Russia do it.
We saw how that worked in the Yugoslav.
Yes, of course. That's a lot of what happened, a lot of the massacres in Bosnia as well. It's hard to give any solid answers right now, but that's what it looks like could happen. Again, the worst could be averted still, but we also have to look at what the worst will be.
And again, the restraint of the Azeri military is not a good bet.
Yes. So we have this situation where Azerbaijan has declared that they once again have sovereignty over this area, and that this area is disarming, that there is an exit from there. So all this put together, it seems as though this is an ethnic cleansing. Armenians are being forced out of Nagorno Karabakh and will not have anyone to defend them against any violence that may occur, which means there will probably still be violence occurring as we speak. So Azerbaijan likely does not want to make it look like they're just going into a town and open firing on everyone they see, but they have created conditions for life that will be unbearable. Like I said, this whole time they have been starving, and now they at least have a way out, which they had not had before. So most will probably take that way out into the Republic of Armenia. Well, who knows what will happen to who is not allowed to leave. So that's the situation now. Meanwhile, if we look at Armenia proper, the Republic of Armenia, there is mass protests against the Armenian government due to the fact that the Armenian military was told they would not be doing anything to let Azerbaijan do this without resistance from the Republic of Armenia. And Pashinyan, the leader of Armenia, has been under a lot of criticism for these last years that he has been too soft on Azerbaijan, that he has not protected the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. And as we talked about within the interview we had about this a few episodes back with Karina Avdizian, that the Armenian government had more or less accepted the fait accompli of Azerbaijan that they would be taking over Nagorno-Karabakh at some point in the near future, as what just happened, or what's in the process of happening.
Now, not to defend Pashinyan, again, we're not Armenian and it's not really our place, but I would like to note that Pashinyan is, under any circumstances, in a very unenviable position in recent days. Literally in recent weeks, he has tried to pivot Armenia to the West, agreeing to joint military exercises with the United States, sending his wife, the First Lady, to Ukraine, a humanitarian conference. So he's kind of now trying to pivot away from Russia, which is clearly uninterested in helping him. In fact, Putin just also met with Aliyev, and we can probably I think, reasonably assume that in that meeting, Putin gave the green light to Aliyev to seize Nagorno Karabakh. So Armenia is really left without friends, and there is an incredible military gap, as the 2020 war showed, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's clear that the Armenian military,
They would have stood no chance. They would have lost.
yes, they would have lost. And while Armenians are understandably and possibly even rightly, again, we're not Armenian, I would hesitate to pass value judgments against Pashinyan for his inaction. The Armenian military will likely not and has not fared well against the Azerbaijani military in open conflict. And if Armenia did interfere, if the Armenian military did cross internationally recognized Azerbaijani borders into Nagorno Karabakh, it would signal outright war. And this rhetoric that Azerbaijan has used towards Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh has not been limited to Karabakh, limited to the Republic of Artsakh. It has been, it has extended to threats against Yerevan directly. Aliyev has said that Armenia is not worth having on the map. Azeri lawmakers have said that actually there has never been a state like Armenia, and that land is all Azeri and should return to Azerbaijan. So there is a very fine line for any Armenian leader at the moment to walk to basically try to make sure that his nation isn't the next target. But given the proclivities of dictators, I'm not really sure that that is a line that can.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the international community accepts Nagorno Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan and therefore has offered basically no real resistance to the idea of Azerbaijan taking over Nagorno Karabakh.
What was the word they used in colonial times? A police action.
Yes. So with the exception of Russia, but we'll get into that into a second. But other countries, especially Iran, have said that if Azerbaijan was to move on to the Republic of Armenia, they would take action. Basically the world in general would take it much more seriously if Azerbaijan moved on to the Republic of Armenia and not just a territory that everyone recognized as part of Azerbaijan, even if Azerbaijan had not controlled it up until this point. And no matter what your opinion of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh may be, that was its political reality. So Pashinyan was left with a decision, which was allow Nagorno-Karabakh to be ethnically cleansed and try to protect the Republic of Armenia, or go into war with Azerbaijan, lose, and have all of Armenia, both Republic of Armenia and the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh, all of it subjected to genocide. And that is not a decision that anyone wants to make, but Pashinyan had to make it, and, well, he's now going to face a lot of political problems because of it. But on this Russia topic, because ultimately this is a Ukraine podcast, so we have to talk about the Russian role in this. Russia...
Well, it is Ukraine and the region.
Yes, Ukraine and the region. Well, Russia was supposed to guarantee the safety of Artsakh. With the conclusion of the last war 3 years ago, there were Russian peacekeepers put in place to avoid this exact situation that just happened. But throughout those 3 years, those peacekeepers have done effectively nothing. Every time Azerbaijan has taken a few steps forward, the Russian peacekeepers took a few steps back. So broadly speaking, they just haven't done it. Also, with the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, Russian peacekeepers were supposed to oversee it and allow this corridor to supply the people of Nagorno-Karabakh with food to stay open. They did not do so. Now, again, like with Romeo just said, there was a meeting between Aliyev and Putin where it seems as though it's very likely that Aliyev was given the green light to go do this. And if we look at Russian media right now, it's all blaming Armenia. Armenia, who is supposed to be their ally in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, They say Russia is saying that Armenia is wholly responsible. They get what they have coming, and much worse than that. So we have to reach out to those people who may be listening who think that Armenia and Russia are good allies. Well, in this, Azerbaijan was fully backed by Russia in this action. They were given the green light to do it by Russia. They were given the military equipment to do it by Russia. Behind the scenes, Azerbaijan is doing a lot to support the Russian government, which Armenia is simply incapable of because it's a small and poor country, especially regarding transit of fossil fuels. And now we have Russian propaganda machine, which has been saying how Ukraine is to blame for everything, is now also saying Armenia was to blame for everything. So the vulgar campism of believing that Ukrainians have to support Azerbaijan in this because Armenia is Russia's friend is a simple absurdity that completely ignores the actual facts on the ground in favor of some imaginary alliance between powers that is non-existent, as is all campism. So I just have to say to all of you listening, support people who are about to face something terrible and put aside your diplomatic and political proclivities.
And to put on our ideological hats, fuck states. Support people. People are the things that matter. States are literally things we have dreamed into being and then pretend are useful pretty much purely for administrative and organizational purposes. They have zero and possibly even negative moral weight in the long run. People are the things that matter. When bad things happen to people, it is the people you should care about.
Yeah, like we rarely talk about, leftist theory here, although we are a left podcast. But I do kind of want it to get into that now, which is I am not fully comfortable with the idea of states. I'm anarchist curious. I don't know, somewhere within the left socialist tradition. Don't know if I want to call myself an anarchist completely or not. But part of what makes me lean away from it is with Ukraine, the idea of the state has been very important in protecting myself and the ones I love. The state is who is fighting the enemy. The state is making the argument that its legal borders recognized by the world are inviolate and that other countries have to support the idea that you cannot change borders no matter what anyone may say. It's a very kind of statist position that Ukraine is taking, and that is very important to our survival, as I just said. And in the absence of that kind of state structure, within the absence of that kind of recognition of territorial integrity of internationally recognized borders, Ukraine would have a harder time gaining support because these are concepts that are very deeply held by every country for obvious reasons. They're countries. They rely on them as well. If we look at China, part of the reason why China is a bit shy about Russia is that they don't like the idea that borders can change even if there is a referendum that is either correct or not. China cannot believe that people living in an area are allowed to not be part of the state that they are a part of. Hence Taiwan, internationally recognized borders of China, but we all recognize it's not the same thing. And they can't change that. So this statist idea is important in the Ukraine conflict for very pragmatic reasons. However, if we look at other places, they are not as useful for pragmatic reasons. In Azerbaijan, they do make the argument that Nagorno Karabakh is the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan, and that is pretty well established. Other than Armenia, you're not going to find anyone who disagrees with that, or at least on a government level that disagrees with that. But there's this population that if they are a part of the Azeri state, they're dead or expelled. So personally, I hold human life to a higher value than territorial integrity. Territorial integrity is not that important to me. I care about the people who live in a place. I care that Russia is killing the people in Ukraine in the areas it took over. The soil doesn't mean anything. The people living on the soil do. And the people living on the soil also have a right to self-determination. And the ones in occupied Ukrainian territory, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, self-determined to be part of Ukraine. And there have been no valid referenda since then to challenge that. I feel that if Ukraine went into the occupied territories and wanted to kill people there, that would not be an acceptable thing to do. The issue is they don't want to do that because it's absurd. Why would they want to do that? It's not a thing that anyone has ever said that they want to do, and they won't do.
For direct evidence that Ukraine has not been doing this, Luhansk and Donetsk are intact. Ukraine has no interest in killing its own countrymen. That's really what it boils down to. While taking Crimea will be more complex than that, that principle will still hold. These people are Ukrainian. They have been occupied.
Precisely. While the people who moved to Crimea since 2014 likely will not continue to have residency rights there. And that's an obvious fact. The people who were Ukrainian, who lived there before the occupation and were not a part of the occupation, even if they may have supported Russia, they're still Ukrainian, and their political rights and human rights will have to be respected. And this will create some complicated political issues that will exist when Crimea is deoccupied. But that's something that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society will have to deal with. What we can't do is kill them all, which is what Azerbaijan wants to do with Nagorno Karabakh.
And let's say less anarchist curious than Anthony is. I'm much more of a traditional and orthodox Marxist. But the fact is, and I do think that people should be allowed to live in their homes without interference. That is, fundamentally, I do, as a Ukrainian, I do feel a connection to the soil. It is like my hometown of Vinnytsia and my house there. It has been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather earned that house after his service fighting the Third Reich. And Vinnytsia more broadly is my home. It is where I was born. It is where my mom was born, my grandmother was born, where my parents got married, where I got married. It is home, and I definitely do feel a connection to this. And I think it is not unreasonable that people should have the right to live where they have lived for generations. There are, of course, exceptions of the natural variety. If an area was flooded or subjected to some other catastrophe, evacuation is regrettable, but ultimately unavoidable. But political disputes are political disputes. They are never a reason to expel populations from their homes en masse.
Yeah, and governments, like all forms of political organization, could be state, could be not state. They exist to serve the interests and the safety and the lives and the welfare of the people who constitute them. And Azerbaijan has made it clear through its actions, through most of its rhetoric, although it often lies, that the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, they do not see as part of the Azerbaijan political culture, community, and have to be expelled because of it. They are not looking to safeguard the safety of these people.
They're not looking to establish Armenian Oblast in Azerbaijan.
Right. The lines on the map say that it belongs to Azerbaijan, but even Azerbaijan does not have any interest in the people living there, which is completely backwards of how political communities are supposed to be. So yes, this concept of territorial integrity, it is something that serves the interests of people, and if it does not serve the interests of people, you have to find another tool instead. That is something that many Ukrainians may not want to hear, because territorial integrity as a concept has been very important to Ukraine for the reasons I said. But even then, Ukrainians say all the time, it's not about the land per se, it's the people, and that's why we can't give up the land. Continue that line of thinking outwards, and I'm sure you'll reach the same conclusions. And one pretty explicit ideological argument that Azerbaijan has been using is that they are essentially allowed to do whatever they want within their own internationally recognized borders. That they can do what they want to the people who live within the lines on the map. And, well, that is literally the logic used to defend the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, which we're talking about a genocide against Armenians. We have to talk about the Armenian genocide by the Ottomans. And that is why they said they were allowed to do what they did. But in the field of international law, in the general conception of what a state is, in the time since the Holocaust, in the time of these international statutes of genocide and various rules preventing states from being tyrannical, we're not supposed to believe that anymore. There is supposed to be a duty of states to their people that other countries are supposed to uphold, even when that violates the sovereignty of the country in question. It is a very dated and very horrific and scary and consequential, as we have seen in the events of the 20th century. It's not acceptable anymore, even if in many ways we treat it as it is. It's not an ideology that can be tolerated.
And just to cap this off, as before we sign off for today's episode, I recently had a discussion with my wife. I was trying to explain the situation to her, and she said, well, I know that they've been fighting for ages. There have been expulsions and atrocities committed on both sides. Like, why should I care now? And I told her that is precisely the language that the rest of the world uses about Ukraine. She's like, no, that's different. I told her, how? No one, and believe you me, I am not exaggerating, very few people give a shit what happens to Ukraine outside of Ukraine. That is quite simply a fact. They are always more concerned with whatever their domestic issues are than what is going on. And the same is true for Armenia and Azerbaijan. People simply don't care. That's why we have to care. That is the simple fact. The world shrugs and turns its back is why we as humans have a duty and a responsibility to give a shit. So instead of saying, well, how to me, they've been killing each other for centuries, we don't just say, let God sort them out. But instead we face that and we say, this is not right. This is evil, wrong. And we will use whatever platforms and powers we have to try and rectify, even in a little bit, the tremendous injustice being committed before our eyes.
Yes, solidarity is a responsibility you have, not an aesthetic that you put on. So with that, we'll be closing off this episode. When I'm done editing this, I'm sure there'll be more changes in the next day. So this is where I'm going to cut in any kind of updates that occur. Hello, pre-release Anthony here, and I will give some updates to what has happened within the previous day since recording. Fighting is still going on, though Azerbaijan seems to have near complete control over the situation. It seems as though their intention was to condition the humanitarian corridor out of Nagorno Karabakh on the Armenians handing over a specified list of people, mostly government officials and military officials, to be transferred over to Azeri custody. And from there, anyone can guess on that. But there will not be safety until that list is complied with. At least that is what the demand was. There are many reports of war crimes, executions, tortures, rapes. There is a Telegram channel of people in Nagorno Karabakh trying to get in touch with missing loved ones who they are no longer in contact with. And Azeris have taken to that channel and have used it to basically put out bounties on these people, including people offering hundreds of dollars to find people on these missing person lists so that they can rape them. That includes children. We are not seeing any actions by anyone to prevent these things from happening, and it's unlikely that we will. We've also seen incidents of Russian peacekeepers being fired upon by the Azeris and possibly the Armenians. There's some fuzziness on that, but definitely by the Azeris, including a deputy commander of the Russian peacekeeping mission there having been killed, along with other officers that he was with. We will keep you updated on this situation, and we'll have an interview with someone in Yerevan. So with that, if you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, please go to the link tree in our list. I'll also be providing a link to the documentary I listed at the top. Bullet Holes is what it is called. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, please go to our Patreon and subscribe to one of our tiers, join our Discord channel, and we'd love to hear feedback. Rate us, like us, all the things that you do with media, you know what to do. And with that, I'd like to thank our very generous subscribers. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, William, David Shepard, Dawson, Giorgio, Ivana Kukratskaya, Michael Drucker, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Bedikin, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri, Etienne, James Burke, Jan, Jenny Louise, Justin Devendorf, Kevin Albritton, Michael Wickman, Mike Perone, Sander Bongers, Shieldwall, T-Bart, Vivek, Adam Poppenheimer, Aidan McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Barbara, Big Rob, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Crystal Burns, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Emily Bavona, Eric Honnold, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, James Wise, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Laura De Leon, Levy Grove, Marguerite, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Gilselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, Randy McNerlin, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Berry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tarkayuk, Steve Bien, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontineva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much. You are what make this all possible. So until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!